The Silent Plague: How Syphilis Shaped the Lives and Legacies of History's Icons. History is not merely a record of events, but a palimpsest, a parchment where the official story is written over layers of obscured truth. We celebrate genius, valorize power, and immortalize artistry, often through carefully sanitized lenses. The textbooks and biographies present polished narratives of triumph and tragedy, yet they frequently omit a pervasive, silent collaborator in these dramas: disease. Among the most potent and hidden of these biological conspirators was syphilis. For centuries, this malady, dubbed Louis, or the Great Imitator, did not just infect bodies. It infiltrated destinies, warped minds, and quietly steered the course of cultures. Before the miracle of antibiotics, it was a shadow pandemic among the elite and creative classes, a secret scourge whose stigma was so profound it demanded a conspiracy of silence. Diagnoses were whispered, death certificates falsified, and medical histories buried to preserve reputations. This is not a medical treatise, but a historical detective story. It examines the lives of 6 legendary figures through a revised lens, suggesting that their celebrated brilliance and baffling declines were inextricably linked to Treponema pallidum, the spiral-shaped bacterium that causes syphilis. Their symptoms: paranoia, manic creativity, erratic behavior, cognitive collapse, and physical decay were often mislabeled as the excesses of genius, the wages of sin, or simple madness. In exploring the cases of Oscar Wilde, Howard Hughes, Edgar Allan Poe, John Barrymore, Al Capone, and Paul Muni, we uncover a tragic pattern: individuals who shaped the modern world were, in their final acts, shaped and ultimately defeated by a microscopic adversary. Their stories, spanning from the gaslit anxieties of the 19th century to the glittering darkness of mid-20th century America, reveal a haunting intersection of biology and biography. Let's start with the nature of the foe. Syphilis as historical actor. To understand its impact, one must first comprehend the adversary. Syphilis is a master of deception. Its primary stage, a painless chancre, often fades, leading the infected to believe the trouble has passed. A secondary stage of rashes and fevers can mimic countless other ailments. Then, the disease can enter a latent period, hiding for years, even decades, before erupting in its tertiary stage. This is when it becomes a historical catalyst. Tertiary syphilis is where the bacterium wages its war on history. It can manifest as neurosyphilis, attacking the brain and spinal cord, leading to general paresis characterized by personality changes, megalomania, and progressive dementia, or tabes dorsalis, causing loss of coordination and agonizing pains. It can also form gamma-destructive lesions on bones, skin, and internal organs. The symptoms read like a checklist for dramatic downfall: grandiose delusions, paralyzing depression, acute paranoia, stunning memory loss, and a physical wasting that seems almost gothic. A neurologist specializing in historical pathology notes, the disease's progression made it the perfect hidden killer of the famous. The early stages could be dismissed as stress or a passing malaise. The late-stage neurological symptoms: the erratic judgment, the bursts of manic energy followed by profound lassitude, the loss of social inhibition, could easily be attributed to the artistic temperament, alcoholic excess, or the eccentricities permitted to the powerful. Their deterioration was hiding in plain sight, misdiagnosed by contemporary observers, lacking our medical framework. Furthermore, the treatments available before penicillin were often as dreadful as the disease. Mercury salves and pills caused salivation, tooth loss, and neurological damage of their own, creating a horrific cycle of poisoning. The later use of arsenic-based drugs like Salvarsan 606 was a step forward, but was toxic, lengthy, and not always effective, especially if the disease had reached the nervous system. The stigma compounded the medical failure. To admit to a venereal disease was a profound social and moral condemnation, particularly for public figures. Thus, silence became a complicit actor in these tragedies. The cruelest irony lies in the timeline. The lives of all 6 subjects ended either just before or in the early dawn of the antibiotic age. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, and its effectiveness against syphilis was proven by the early 1940s. By the 1950s, a simple course of injections could cure the infection. It is one of history's most profound tragedies, reflects a biographer, that these extraordinary individuals, who changed literature, aviation, cinema, and the very fabric of their times, were brought low not by a worthy human rival, but by a bacterium that would, within years, be rendered nearly powerless. Their fame and fortunes were useless against an enemy they could not see, and a society that would not speak its name. First, the aesthetics agony. Oscar Wilde. We begin not with the criminal or a recluse, but with the very apostle of aestheticism. Oscar Wilde's life was a performance of wit, beauty, and subversive intellect. The author of The Importance of Being Earnest and The Picture of Dorian Gray embodied a philosophy where life imitates art, yet his final act, in a shabby Paris hotel room, was a grim realism he never authored. While his imprisonment for gross indecency in 1895 is rightly cited as his great trauma, it may have accelerated a biological collapse already in motion. Wilde's death at 46, officially from cerebral meningitis, fits a pattern consistent with meningovascular neurosyphilis. Friends like Robert Sherrard and Frank Harris documented his physical decline after his 1897 release. Recurrent ear infections, otitis, a persistent skin condition, and severe headaches. The ear infections are particularly telling. They can be a pathway for the syphilitic infection to reach the meninges, the membranes enclosing the brain. His cognitive state, however, remained fiercely luminous in flashes. On his deathbed, reportedly gazing at the garish wallpaper, he quipped, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." The wit endured, even as the substrate of the brain was under siege. When might he have contracted it? The myth, often homophobically tinted, suggests his homosexual relationships were the cause. This is a misreading. Biographers point to Wilde's youth at Oxford and his early years in London. Wilde was a heterosexual man who had relations with prostitutes before his full embrace of homosexuality, explains a literary scholar. The Magdalen college boy was as much a product of Victorian sexual mores as the later dandy. Contracting syphilis from a prostitute in the 1872 was tragically commonplace. The disease could then have lain dormant for 2 decades, its tertiary stage unleashed by the physical and psychological ravages of hard labor in reading Gaul. The parallel to his own work is haunting. The Picture of Dorian Gray is the tale of a hidden corruption that manifests not on the face of the libertine, but on his secret portrait. Wilde himself may have been living a biological version of his parable, the brilliant, unblemished public persona masking a slow, internal decay. His final, desperate months in Paris, moving between cheap hotels under the pseudonym Sebastian Melmoth, were marked by sporadic attempts to write, fleeting lucidity, and a growing physical disintegration. The man who declared, "I have put my genius into my life, only my talent into my work," found his life ultimately consumed by a force more powerful than scandal, a spirochete. Had penicillin been available, the exile might have been temporary. The pen might have produced more masterpieces. Instead, we are left with the epitaph from the Ballad of Reading Gaul, which echoes with unintended personal resonance. For each man kills the thing he loves. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Perhaps some also did it with a silent, bacterial kiss. Second, the aviator's descent. Howard Hughes. If Wilde's tragedy was played out in public exile, Howard Hughes's was conducted in a private, sterile prison of his own making. The narrative of Hughes is an American epic, the young, handsome billionaire inheritor who became a pioneering aviator, a daring film producer, and a technological visionary. Yet, the second half of his life morphs into a chilling study in decay. While obsessive-compulsive disorder (OCD) and prodigious drug use are cited, a strong circumstantial case suggests neurosyphilis was the foundational architect of his madness. Hughes's promiscuity in his Hollywood heyday is legendary. Throughout the 1930s and 1940 seconds, he had a string of affairs with iconic actresses Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Ginger Rogers, among many others. This was his primary period of risk. The onset of his most debilitating symptoms aligns ominously with the typical latency period for tertiary syphilis. In the 1950s, his eccentricities hardened into debilitating pathologies. His famed fastidiousness became germophobic ritual, code-named Operation Baseline. His aides had to follow written manuals for handing him objects, using stacks of Kleenex as protective barriers. He watched the same films hundreds of times, existed on a diet of chicken and milk, and injected himself with staggering quantities of codeine. A neuropsychiatrist analyzing the case states, "The combination of symptoms is textbook. The megalomania and grandiosity, his belief he could single-handedly win or redesign entire aircraft industries, the intense paranoia belief that the FBI, the CIA, and business rivals were poisoning him, the specific OCD rituals around contamination, and the eventual catatonic physical neglect all are hallmarks of advanced general paresis. The disease destroys the frontal and temporal lobes, eroding judgment, inflaming phobias, and dismantling the very capacity for self-care. Why was it not diagnosed or treated? Hughes was surrounded by a Mormon mafia of aides and compliant personal physicians. These doctors were employees, not independent practitioners, notes a medical ethicist. Their job was to keep Hughes functional for business decisions, not to confront him with a stigmatizing diagnosis requiring rigorous treatment. Suggesting the great Howard Hughes had a venereal disease was unthinkable. By the 1960s, his reclusiveness made proper examination impossible. He lived in darkened penthouse suites, communicating via memos, his body deteriorating from self-neglect. When he died in 1976 en route to a hospital, the once strapping 6'4" aviator was a skeletal, unrecognizable figure with inches-long hair and fingernails, his body riddled with untreated ailments. The tragedy is underscored by timing. Penicillin was widely available by the mid-1940s. Had Hughes been diagnosed even in the early 1950 seconds, a course of antibiotics could have halted the neurological march. Instead, his vast fortune, which could buy islands and influence governments, was powerless against the enemy within. His final, ghostly years represent a grotesque inversion of the American dream. Absolute freedom becoming absolute isolation, vast control yielding to total chaos, all potentially triggered by a bacterium contracted in an area of glamorous, unprotected passion. Third, the poet's darkening psyche. Edgar Allan Poe. The death of Edgar Allan Poe is a mystery worthy of his own tales. Found delirious on the streets of Baltimore in October 1849, wearing ill-fitting, soiled clothes, not his own, he was taken to a hospital, where he spent 4 days in a state of frenzied hallucination, calling out for a mysterious Reynolds before dying. The cause was listed as congestion of the brain or phrenitis, vague terms for inflammation. Theories have abounded: alcoholism, rabies, carbon monoxide poisoning, epilepsy, even murder. However, the theory of neurosyphilis offers a coherent explanation that ties together his final crisis and his later life behaviors. Poe's lifestyle placed him at high risk. His time as a young cadet at West Point and his earlier stint in the Army were environments with high rates of venereal disease. The literary scholar notes, the 19th century urban male, particularly one moving through military and bohemian circles, had a significant statistical chance of exposure. Poe's own writings reference the pestilence that walks unseen, Critically, accounts from his later years describe not a constant drunkard, but a man with an unnaturally low tolerance for alcohol. A single glass of wine could make him visibly and disastrously intoxicated. A contemporary noted, "This hypersensitivity is a recognized red flag," explains the neurologist. In neurosyphilis, the damage to the brain's blood vessels and tissues can create an extreme sensitivity to alcohol, what looked like rampant alcoholism to his detractors, including his moralistic executor, Rufus Griswold, who cemented that reputation may actually have been the neurological reaction of a brain already compromised by tryponema pallidum. The symptoms in his final years align with progressive neurological damage, mood swings, from deep melancholia to feverish creativity, periods of confusion and forgetfulness, and the profound, debilitating anxiety that permeates works like The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher. His deathbed delirium, the hallucinations, the agitation, the lucid intervals is classic for a final syphilitic crisis. The profound irony is that Poe, the architect of American Gothic, may have been channeling his own neurological weather into his art. The hypersensitivity to sound, the obsession with heartbeats and muffled pulses, the themes of being buried alive, a metaphor for the terror of a paralyzed consciousness, the narrators who cannot trust their own perceptions, all could be read as literary transmutations of neurosyphilitic experience. He did not just imagine horror, he may have been living it. His death at 40 robbed American literature of its most innovative voice at the very moment European writers like Baudelaire were beginning to champion him. The mystery of his end becomes less a puzzle of foul play and more a tragedy of biology, a brilliant mind, attuned to the deepest tremors of fear, ultimately consumed by the very real terror unfolding within his own skull. Fourth, the profiles fade to black. John Barrymore. John Barrymore, the great profile, was the crown prince of America's theatrical royalty. From his legendary Hamlet on Broadway to his swashbuckling film roles, he combined preternatural beauty with astounding technical skill. His decline is most often blamed on alcohol, a narrative he himself encouraged with self-deprecating wit. Yet, those closest to him and modern medical historians see a more complex tragedy. Alcohol was the accomplice, says a film biographer, but the master criminal may well have been syphilis. Barrymore's sexual exploits were as famous as his performances. He moved through the worlds of New York theater and early Hollywood with an insatiable appetite, a time when syphilis was endemic in both communities. The timeline of his collapse is revealing. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, despite heavy drinking, his performances remained sharp. By the mid-1930s, a precipitous decline began. He suffered catastrophic memory loss, unable to retain lines for more than moments. Studios employed feeders to whisper his dialogue off camera, or used cue cards extensively. His behavior grew wildly erratic. He would urinate off balconies, deliver monologues to empty rooms, and swing between charming lucidity and abusive confusion. A neuroscientist reviewing the case notes, General Paresis, explains this pattern perfectly. The memory loss, the personality changes, the lewdness, the grandiosity, the paranoia, the loss of motor coordination. It's a classic presentation. Alcohol-induced Korsakoff syndrome causes memory problems, but not the same rapid, global personality disintegration Barrymore exhibited. The industry and his family conspired in the cover-up. The Barrymores were dynasty, explains a Hollywood historian. To admit that Jack was suffering from a shameful disease was unthinkable. It was far better for the legend, and for box office in his dwindling roles, to let the public believe it was just demon rum. His rapid physical aging, his handsome face, bloated and lined, was attributed to drink. His final films are painful to watch. the ghost of a great actor, eyes sometimes searching in confusion, held together by editing trickery and the kindness of directors like George Cukor. He died at 60 from cirrhosis and kidney failure, complications consistent with both alcoholism and late-stage syphilis. In his final years, he was a haunted figure, sometimes brilliant in conversation, more often lost. His story is the archetype of the fallen idol, but the pedestal may have been eroded from within by a disease contracted in the glow of his early triumphs. The man who could make thousands weep as Hamlet ended his days unable to remember the soliloquy, a living testament to the fragility of genius in the face of an unforgiving biological fate. Fifth, the gangster's unseen enemy Al Capone. 1899-1947. Alphonse Scarface Capone's story is the archetypal rise and fall. The immigrant boy who built a bootlegging empire, defied the federal government, and became the symbol of Prohibition-era lawlessness. His downfall is attributed to Eliot Ness and tax evasion, leading to imprisonment at Alcatraz. But the true conqueror of America's most notorious gangster was neither G-man nor accountant. It was Tropone Pallidum. Capone likely contracted syphilis in his youth, possibly in the brothels he frequented, and later controlled. As part of his criminal portfolio, the disease incubated for 2 decades. While imprisoned on Alcatraz in the late 1930s, prison physicians diagnosed him with advanced syphilis, noting signs of paresis. He was treated with the era's best available drugs, likely malaria-induced fever therapy, which sometimes helped, but the neurological damage was irreversible. Upon his 1939 release, due to his failing health, the formidable mob boss was a shell. The criminal strategist who orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day massacre now had the cognitive function of a child. He would spend hours fishing in the lagoon of his Palm Island, Florida, estate with a bamboo pole. Convinced of his catch, he suffered violent mood swings and lived in a state of paranoia and confusion. The transformation was absolute, notes a crime historian. The force of nature that was Capone was reduced to a docile, bewildered man who needed constant care. His family protected him fiercely, and the public image of the fearsome gangster faded into this pathetic, private reality. He died in 1947 from a stroke and pneumonia, secondary complications to his ravaged system. The timing, again, is cruel. Penicillin's efficacy against syphilis was being proven just as Capone entered his final decline. A simple treatment a decade earlier could have saved his mind, if not his soul. Capone's end offers a stark moral and medical lesson. Neither wealth nor violence nor power could protect him from a biological equalizer. The man who terrorized Chicago was ultimately terrorized by his own body. His brain betrayed by an infection acquired in the very underworld he came to rule. And finally, the sixth one, the character actor's hidden character, Paul Muni. The case of Paul Muni is perhaps the most subtle, a slow fade rather than a dramatic collapse. The Oscar-winning actor for The Story of Louis Pasteur was revered for his immersive, chameleonic transformations in biopics like The Life of Émile Zola and Juarez. In the early 1950s, at the height of his prestige, he abruptly withdrew from film and largely from public life. Officially, it was due to worsening eyesight, heart trouble, and rheumatoid arthritis. But whispers within the industry and patterns in his behavior suggest another, unspoken factor. Muni came from the Yiddish theater, another environment with high syphilis rates in the early 20th century. His retreat was not clean. He would accept a role, then withdraw, citing health. Colleagues noted uncharacteristic memory lapses and moments of disorientation. On set during his later films, there was a volatility that wasn't there before, said one director anonymously. He was the most prepared actor in Hollywood, and then he wasn't. A medical historian speculates the pattern of somatic complaints, joint pain, cardiac issues coupled with cognitive flickering and a slow, reluctant exit from his life's work, is consistent with the varied manifestations of tertiary syphilis. It doesn't always present as florid madness. Sometimes it's a slow dimming, a gradual erosion of the faculties needed to perform at the highest level. Muni lived until 1967, a long life compared to others on this list. But his final 2 decades were a shadow of his artistic prime. The silence around his health was typical of the era and his dignified persona. To suggest the serious, dedicated Muni suffered from a shameful disease would have been anathema to the studio system and his own proud legacy. His story represents the quieter casualties of the plague, not the spectacular flameouts, but the slow, dignified extinguishing of a brilliant light, with the true cause hidden behind a veil of more acceptable, somatic ailments. The stories of Wilde, Hughes, Poe, Barrymore, Capone, and Muni are not merely medical curiosities. They are foundational corrections to the historical record. They force us to re-examine the nexus of creativity, power, and pathology. How much of what we call mad genius was infectious encephalopathy? How many alcoholic downfalls were actually the consequence of a brain hypersensitive to alcohol due to syphilitic damage? The implications ripple through cultural history. The conspiracy of silence that protected reputations has ultimately done a disservice to our understanding. It created mythologies where there were medical realities. Unmasking this disease in historical figures isn't about prurience or diminishing their achievements, argues the public health historian. It's about compassion and completeness. It allows us to see these individuals not as moral cautionary tales, but as human beings battling an invisible, devastating illness in an era of profound ignorance and stigma. Furthermore, it highlights the monumental, world-altering impact of a single medical breakthrough, penicillin. The antibiotic didn't just cure individuals, it severed a chain of causality that had linked sexual activity with madness, decay, and death for centuries. It freed future generations from the shadow that fell so heavily on these 6 men. Their collective tragedy is a monument to a defeated enemy. In studying them, we witness the end of an era, dark age of medicine where the most brilliant minds could be laid low by a microscopic spiral. They stand as reminders of humanity's vulnerability, the price of stigma, and the profound grace of scientific progress. Their lives, in all their brilliance and anguish, were shaped by a silent plague, whose final, terrible secret is now revealed. It was not their souls that were condemned, but their biology, and for that, a cure was always just beyond the horizon of their time.